site here. And by the way, all my slides are available in PDF or originals, whatever you want. And yeah, see, I know you won't be able to take photos without any cell phone, but you can have my slides.
Yeah, I don't go back to slides, I'm sorry, it's too much work.
Okay, well, just a little bit about me. I grew up on a cattle and grain farm in Manitoba. Worked from about the age of 12, I guess. I was expected to get out there every day, so dawn till dusk, 6 days a week, chores on Sunday, feeding the cattle and bedding them down. And eventually, in my 17th year, I talked my dad into just working 12 hours a day for 6 days a week. So I'd have a little bit of 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. was my standard day. And there wasn't any time left for anything else, pretty much, except for Sunday afternoon, where I'd get together with some of the other youth. And some of our favorite stuff, we'd just ride all our horses to a particular location. And then we'd just head up into the Rocky Mountain National Park. The day. Those were some of our best activities. But I got tired of that, and so at the age of 18, I figured I need a break. I'm going to university. So I went there, did my first degree in physics, and then I realized you can't get a job with a graduate degree in physics, so then I did a degree in engineering. And during that time, I would like to go to a different church every Sunday. I mean, not every Sunday, but each year I'd go to a different church just to try different churches out. And so that particular year, in 1977, I randomly showed up at a particular church. And unbeknownst to me, there was a Bible college. Well, I knew about the Bible college 30 miles south of town, Winnipeg, that is. And they would bus students in and drop them off at 3 different churches in Winnipeg for the weekend. And so there was this girl named Patty, which is my wife now. She got randomly dropped off at the College of Career Place, and I saw her in the classroom, and I wasn't really interested in a relationship at that time because I wanted to focus on studies. I figured that's what God sent me here, but there was something very different about her. So I had to talk with her from time to time. And finally, 3 months after talking, 3 months of talking, our first date, and here we are. We've been married now almost 43 years. We'll be 43 in July. 6 kids, 12 grandkids and counting, and we're having a good time. And she's here somewhere. In the meantime, I worked as an engineer after I finished for Pratt & Whitney. I was in a group of engineers that coordinated the build and test of experimental aircraft engines. And it was really interesting, but after 2 years of working there, we got married, and after 1 year of working there, we got married. She was still a student, transferred to McGill University, finished her degree. But after 2 years, I came home one day and she says, we'd talked about full-time missions. She said, I think, we should decide what we're gonna do. And I said, you're right. And I'd already decided this is it. We need to go into full-time missions of some description, but we didn't know what. So I continued to work for another 2 years, 4 years total, Pratt & Whitney. And we just looked at different things. We felt convicted that we need to work with full-time, like as a career, do something in missions. But one day an elder in our church suggested, what about university students? Yep. I knew instantly, that's it. So, got home, because I was dropping him off at his house. Patty, what about Campus Crusade for Christ? Well, I'd been involved as a student. She had been too. And so we made inquiries to see if they had any openings, which is a bit of a joke because they always have openings. And away we went. My first assignment was University of British Columbia. And for the next 10 years, I worked full-time on campus with students, doing evangelism and discipleship. And one-on-one, probably shared the gospel with around 2,000 students, just one-on-one. And that was really good because I got to talk to every kind of student you could imagine from all over the world. Canada, I don't know what it's like in America, but in Canada, it's very cosmopolitan, students from all over the world in our universities. So during that time, second year actually, the guy who was training me, there was a PhD student in mathematics, who was an atheist, he came over and challenged us to defend the existence of God in a formal debate on campus. And the trainer says, "Hey, Kirk, I think that'd be a good idea. You know, would you like to do that?" And I had just taken a course from William Lane Craig. And I thought, sure. So, and it went well, and then I started doing another one. And then over the next 10 years, I started doing more large group outreaches on universities across the country. And eventually in the UK, a little bit in the northeastern USA, once down in Texas, and a little bit in Europe. Until it got to the point where after 10 years, I needed to speak full time. I was taking all my time now. So I became an apologist with Campus Crusade. Apologist has changed over the years. In the 1980s, there were the traditional questions that you always addressed. Did God exist? Did Jesus rise from the dead? How do we know the Bible's true? You know, what about evil and suffering? That sort of thing. It's really changed in the over 40 years now. I would say the majority of apologetics nowadays needs to be, I would call it's cultural issues. Percent would be cultural issues, or what the challenges are. 20% are still the intellectual ones. You've got to do that. But 80%, and that's rough, 80-20. I ran into students who didn't believe in God because of the problem of evil and suffering. So I decided to do a master's in philosophy on that question in the secular university that I was at. And one of the profs I'd already debated on the existence of God in a formal debate. We kind of became friends afterwards, and he says, "Oh, you're going to lose your faith." And well, we'll see about that. And no, my faith was greatly strengthened during that time. And I focused on the problem of evil, and I wrote a thesis that really was originated out of the book of Job. So there's different ways you can handle it. We're going to spend some time this week looking at the problem of evil from that perspective. And then other students would say, "No, I don't believe in God because of evolution," they would say. And, oh, okay, well, I really got fascinated as an engineer with information, digital information. And I also read a few papers published, a long time ago by a scientist by Hubert Yockey. Physical Letter Reviews, I think, was the first paper, and he talked about information encoded into the genomes of life. And as an engineer, I figured this looks suspiciously like there's a mind here. If we were going to test, we're going to look for fingerprints of a mind, this is what we would look for. In digital information encoded in the genomes of life. And so I started speaking on that, diving into it as an engineer, and then one day a prof from University of Guelph came to one of my seminars and he said, "You know, would you like to do a PhD in this area?" And I thought, yes, because I really need to be able to speak to this at the highest level, to professors, students, whatever. And so I did a PhD in biophysics at the University of Guelph, focusing on digital information encoded in biopolymers, specifically proteins and what it does for protein structure, which you don't need to worry anything about. Bottom line is this, is we'll be looking at it a little bit this week, not much. You've had pretty much a lot of science, I hear, and we're only going to do, I think, just one session on it, but it's going to be a very different session, I think, than what you've been exposed to, because I've been dabbling in the halls of science ever since. Well, ever since I was 1973 when I started as an undergraduate, and just published my last paper about 8 months ago in a science journal. Not my last one, hopefully, but the latest one. So I still continue to keep one foot in the halls of science, and I have seen stuff, and I'm going to tell you about it, and that'll be really what I focus on in that area. Science is not the bastion of truth that the public, modern science, has some serious, serious issues. I'm not going to diss science, but I want you to come away from that session knowing that it's that putting your faith in modern science today is a big mistake, big mistake. We're going to look at that. So anyways, having done those two things, I felt better equipped to be able to talk to students, and then a whole new thing came avalanching along, and that was cultural issues. And so we're going to spend time this week on cultural issues as well. So more recently, in the meantime, Patty and I got married, had a bunch of kids, things we like to do, wilderness canoeing and remote wilderness canoeing camping. Like for our kids, if we saw another human being while we were out there, that was a huge wow, like this is a major blow to our week. We saw another human being. So most of the time we try and go to places in the remote Canadian wilderness where you'd never see another human being, camping on lakes with no names. And there's one lake we like so much that we came back over and over again, and my daughters named it Memory Lake because we built so many family memories on that lake. And there's an island on that lake which they call Memory Island, and so it has a name, unofficial, but on topo maps it's the lake with no name. In fact, one of probably thousands of lakes with no names in Canada. So what else about family? I love nature photography. My youngest daughter is a pro photographer in weddings. She always maxes out every year for what she can handle. She also got four girls, and she's a pastor's wife now. She's about 20, how old is she? Oh, my wife's not here. 26, I think she is, roughly. And then I have a next oldest daughter is Sarah. She's a RN, registered nurse, specializing in various areas of pediatrics in the hospital she works in. Her husband's an engineer. And then next up is Sam, IT guy. He works for Arctic Wolf, which is a cybersecurity company that handles other companies around that takes care of them. He's married to an RN as well. I could tell you stories. I led a Bible study for young adults, and I'd say most of the women in that study were RNs, and just to listen to these women talk, they got stories. It was amazing. Funny stories, not so funny stories, but a lot of funny stories. Then next up is, who's next? Ben. Ben is an insurance guy, married to an insurance woman, and they have one kid. And then we have Daniel, he's next up. He is actually world famous in the backpacking world. Dan Durston. Look up DurstonGear.com. He invented a couple of the Durston X Mid 1P and 2P and variations. The guy is a perfectionist, and if you look up Durston Gear, read the reviews. That's really what speaks, is the reviews, and backpacker.com or whatever. And he is married to a wonderful woman who did a lot of different things, but now it's a cottage business they have, so she's working with him as well. They have one girl. And finally, Josh is my oldest one. What is he? He is a robotics and automated guy, but specializing in cooling and heating of large complexes like nuclear complexes, data centers for the Royal Bank in Canada. Biggest cancer hospital is being built in Calgary right now. That sort of thing. And his wife is almost a stay-at-home mom, but she helps out at a Christian school as well. So that's my family. And so now let's move in. Let's move into this. Just before COVID, I've been intrigued by Christians, not just nominal Christians who just warm a pew, but young Christians who are tossing their faith, abandoning their faith. I've been intrigued by that for a number of years now, and I read their stories, but I decided to dive headfirst into this this is a big issue. It's a major problem. So a friend of mine has done a PhD in deconversion. Deconversion is when you deconvert, you have nothing more to do with Jesus Christ, Christianity, the Bible. That's deconversion. Deconstruction is a little bit different. That's where you start taking apart things to try and understand them better. Deconstruction can be an interesting thing, but it's got completely off the rails nowadays. And we can talk a little bit about why that is so. And then ex-evangelicals. Ex-evangelicals still retain some sort of Christian faith, but they want nothing to do with evangelical Christianity. They tend to be what we would call progressive, go into progressive Christianity, or the term I'm going to use is culture-led Christianity. Culture-led versus Christ-led Christianity. We're going to talk more about that as well. So I read a couple of books on this. I talk on a periodic basis with my friend at Biola, but I really needed to hear firsthand. So my colleague compiled a list of, these are all the people you need to listen to. Listen to their testimonials. Like Rhett and Link, for example. Anybody hear of Rhett and Link? Yeah. former colleagues of mine. I didn't know them personally, but they were in the campus ministry with Campus Crusade just like me, sharing the gospel with people, leading discipleship groups, and then they've abandoned their faith. And there's I think it's 3 episodes, Rattle Link. I've known of young pastors, tossed their link, worship leaders, some of them famous worship leaders, apologists, people well trained in apologetics have tossed their faith. And the thing became evident to me is that there is something deeper here. Apologetics isn't going to save your hide when the going gets rough. There's something was missing here. So I listened to a lot of testimonials, took a lot of notes, and at the end of it all, and I still continue to listen to testimonials, but began to condense it down to look for common denominators, and I found there were 6 major factors in people deconverting. And then when I began to do a video series, I've done about 50 videos, about 10, 12 minutes each, on my YouTube channel. I'll put that up sometime. I realized, they have told us why they abandoned Christianity, but there's something much more interesting here, what they did not talk about, and I'll summarize that. So this week, I want to look at what they did not talk about and then what they did talk about. And the objective here is don't assume that every one of you will survive, you will avoid shipwreck of your faith. Don't assume that. On the other hand, there's no need to be worried about it if you're walking with God. But the shipwreck of the faith, it's a term used in the New Testament. So that's my first priority is to, I can't make sure that doesn't happen to anybody here, but I can do my little part. Secondly, and importantly, is you all are going to become, if you continue to walk with the Lord, you're going to become leaders, whether you want to or not. You may not become leaders as far as official, titles and all that kind of stuff. But people will look to you for leadership. You'll become influencers. Maybe influencer is a better word. You'll become influencers. Maybe not famous YouTubers, but you will be influencers. And people look at you, and you will see people. You will see the warning signs, and you'll be able to build into their lives and hopefully help them not experience shipwreck of their faith. So with all that in mind, let's begin. Let's see if my little thing, this little thing here has a disturbing rattle inside, so we'll see just how it works. Ooh, still works. Okay, so I used to spend most of my time, as far as the evangelism part, as far as public outreaches and all this kind of stuff, targeting non-Christians on university campuses. But over the years, most of my time now is spent, it's such a disaster in the church with, let's say, millennials and Gen Z just packing it in, and the older people aren't so intact either. So most of my ministry now is focused on Christians because we are in a very real war. We're on a battlefield, and you look around and you see there's an enormous number of casualties here, and there's what thought we were fighting against, but we got to start paying attention to our casualties. And okay, you've already heard that, so let's begin. Let's hear what they said. What did these deconverters say? The people who abandoned Christianity. There's 6 major factors here, and here they are. And every one of these is available to you. I don't know. There's got to be a way, if you don't have your phones to photograph this, I can easily do screenshots afterwards, or I don't know, we'll figure something out. Number 1, this has just changed in the last couple of years. The number 1 reason it appears that Christians who are growing up in the church are abandoning their faith is the churches of the Bible's refusal to affirm LGBTQ2S+. I don't know, 2S is a deal in Canada. I don't know whether it is in the US. 2S is more of a First Nations term. Two-spirited is what it means. The two-spirited is a traditional term used amongst the Anishinaabe, Cree, Wendat, a lot of the nations up in Canada anyways. Now the thing was this, they knew what the Bible said. Oh, yes.
What was the number 1 reason before that?
Okay, the number 1 is now the number 2, so we'll get to it's going to be the number 2 reason. So it's moved into number 2, and you could still argue, some people would argue either way, but They knew what the Bible said, it's wrong, but they had no idea. But that wasn't good enough. It was not good enough because they had no idea why it was wrong. There was no theology of sexuality. And indeed, I've just hit that wall recently in the past few months. I realized, wow, most Christians do not have a theology of sexuality. They have a list of rules, but they don't understand why those rules are there. They don't understand what's at stake. And everything is linked to everything else in life, in the spiritual world. So there's no understanding why it's wrong, there's no reason to take seriously the moral statements on sexuality. Number 2 reason, okay, so I'm not diving into these at this point because we're going to spend the rest of the week talking about them. So I know you'd probably want to dive in deeper, but I'm just summarizing what are these six categories. But I should pause. Anytime you want to ask a question like she just did, you ask a question. By the way, I got to try and remember your names. I am Olympic caliber at forgetting names. So forgive me. I am very sorry. But you who asked the question, what is your name? I'll start with your name.
My name is Caitlin.
Caitlin?
Yeah.
Okay, Caitlin. As I said, I apologize in advance if I forget that. Any questions on thing number 1 before we look at the second reason here? Okay, move on. Religious culture was the major reason number 2. Now let me expand on that. It was an expectation-driven form of Christianity that was just exhausting eventually. There were people burning out because they were trying to measure it. And there's 2 forms of expectation-driven Christianity. The first form is legalistic expectations and rules that go above and beyond what the Bible says, and it just eventually turned them right off. It just seems so dead. I've been in places like this. I've been in churches like, wow, I think I'm in a tomb here, and the people are like mummies. I'm talking about the dehydrated kind that you find in Egypt. Mummies, there's death, there's no life here. And eventually they see that and they just had it. I can't live up to these expectations. For example, they said, we were expected to only have Christian friends, only listen to Christian music. When they said only listen to Christian music, I wondered, well, what about only Christian art too? What about furniture in your house? Does it have to be only Christian furniture? There's other questions that come up. And, like when I grew up, you were expected to wear a coat and tie if you're a guy, even as a boy. As a boy, a sport coat, tie, pants. And after church, I have bad memories of playing after church, getting my pants dirty, getting my backside smoked when I got home because I had dirt, mud on my pants. Anyways, my home church has moved way beyond that now. As far as becoming more relaxed about that. Number 2, though, is there's an expectation-driven type of Christianity that arises out of authentic Christianity. So they'll read in the Bible that you should be experiencing the peace that passes understanding. You should be experiencing joy in all things. And there's this idea of the ideal Christian that they have that they know they should be living by. Like an ideal Christian doesn't watch online porn and they're joyful all the time and all this. And they said, on Sundays we just tried so hard to present ourselves as respectable Christians, but we weren't living like that all week. And it became so exhausting to try and live up, because I observe as a bystander, there was no power to live that life. There was no ability to actually experience the peace that passes understanding. And now, what was really interesting, and you may often hear this, many deconverters will say the day or when they decided to totally abandon Christianity, they felt an enormous sense of freedom. Just, wow, I can be myself now. I'm just such a sense of freedom. And that's the very opposite of what I experienced. And the question was, why? Well, it was freedom from this enslavement of trying to meet up these expectations all the time. Any questions on this second thing? Oh, one other one that they would often mention, this is more in the US, this is not really a thing in Canada, but Christian nationalism. For example, I listened to some American deconverters, and they would say, if you're a believer, you got to vote Republican at all costs. It doesn't matter what sort of heinous stuff whoever it is you vote for is done, you need to vote Republican. But they would look at the Democrats, let's say, and the Republicans, and I don't mean to get political here because keep in mind I'm a Canadian, I don't know a whole lot about this, but they thought when you mix politics, and I would agree on this point, when Christianity and politics become, here's your statement of faith and here's your political thing, and that's right there with your statement of faith. When it becomes like that, when you hitch your wagon to the wrong horses, or to any horse at all, then you got to take the consequences of what happens when that horse decides to head off in a direction. We actually see that. Patty and I live in a old order, at a place of Mennonites that still drive horse and buggies. And every once in a while, some team of horses will decide they get scared or something, head right across the field. I was coming home from church one day, and there's a couple taking an involuntary high-speed ride through the grain field. The two horses had got spooked on something. But anyways, be very careful on what you hitch your wagon to. And they were just totally turned off by Christians who were almost political first and Christians second. Reason number 3 was a shocker to me: hell. Hell was, many of them brought up this idea of hell. They see it as a highly repugnant and a coercive ploy. A loving God would not send people to hell. Therefore, this is bogus. In fact, I have a friend who's a deconverter, and I meet with him about once a month for breakfast, and we have lots of conversations, and this is his number 1 beef. We can talk about everything, but we pretty much can't talk about hell because he just gets irate and emotional, and you can't have a good conversation anymore. Number 4, the problem of suffering, injustice, and evil in this world. John Steingard, for example, musician, talked about children abandoned in the jungle in Africa. When you don't want that child, you leave him in the jungle, and the animals will take care of business. And when he heard about this, what kind of a God would allow little kids to be abandoned in a jungle to be eaten by whatever's out there? Then there's so many children and good people suffering unjustly. What kind of God would allow that? We're actually spent 2 sessions on the problem of evil. Then there's science. And the two big ones is Genesis chapter 1, and the other is the theory of evolution. And Genesis chapter 1 really is the parent age of the universe and stuff. And then there's the theory of evolution, and they just saw that as a flat-out contradiction. So I would actually ask students, they would say, I'm an atheist. Oh, so how come? Evolution, they would say. And that was really interesting. So I say, can you fill this me in a bit? Like, how does it follow that if you have evolution over here, God does not exist? And usually there was not a lot of connecting of the dots there. But just as a heads up here, my own work in information theory shows that the large-scale evolution is utterly impossible. And I hope my last paper, if I can get it published, will really underscore why this is the case. And it has to do with information, is that nature cannot generate the magnitude of information we're seeing in the genomes of life. But I jump ahead. Science, oh yes, Marty Sampson, another famous worship leader who abandoned the faith. Science keeps piercing the truth of every religion. And here's an observation. The assumption that science is the gold standard of truth. I see that all over the place. Now, that's not all of our culture, mind you. There's a whole new, very liberal, left-wing kind of culture who actually sees science as racist and bigoted and white supremacists and everything else. So science is not the only thing out there right now that we have to deal with. In fact, I would say that's minor. And there's good news about science. I don't want to keep getting you too depressed about that. Good news about science. But this general assumption, if you read an article in a newspaper by some science editor, that's the gospel truth. And as a scientist, if scientists get together and they start talking about these science articles in newspapers, it's just facepalm, bad, a lot of times, because there's a lot lost between actual science and what you're going to read in online and in the newspaper. Okay, the other one, major reason was more specific theistic evolution. Rhett and Link talk about that. and a figurative Adam, which is a new big thing, figurative Adam. And they just couldn't, they say, look, if they thought that was going to save their faith. And so they landed on that for a while, but they realized, wait a sec, if it's a figurative Adam, then that has implications for a lot of passages in the New Testament, what Paul said and Jesus said. And so we're going to have to do some figurative massaging over there. And then they realized, this whole thing's falling apart here. I'm gone. And that's, Rhett and Link talk about that in their testimonial. Number 6 and last is what I call Bible problems. Bible problems. So number 1, sacrifice of Isaac. What kind of a God would ask Abraham to offer his son as a burnt offering? What about the wiping out of the Canaanites? A lot of times you hear the word genocide. Well, what kind of God would order somebody to destroy every man, woman, and child in this whole culture? We're going to look at that one. Slavery in the Bible. What about rape culture in the Bible? And then there's the contradictions, which I hear about all the time. I actually, when I was in high school, I thought, wow, to listen to everybody, this thing must be loaded with contradictions. So I decided I'll see for myself. And I got a journal, and I started reading through from Genesis to Revelation, looking for contradictions and writing them in my journal. And I was shocked at how few there were. In fact, I would get some written out, and then another passage would clarify that, and okay, I can't really call that a contradiction yet. I just didn't read the thing within its context, or a little bit. Or one guy handed me a sheet, multiple computer printout pages of contradictions in the Bible. And I started working through them, and it was like a couple of guys sat down, maybe had a few beers too many one night on a winter's night around the fireplace, and started just randomly picking phrases out of the Bible that would contradict other phrases. So I'm not going to deal a lot with the contradictions because that's a whole different approach. You don't actually handle them one at a time. With a person that's raising that objective, there's a whole different approach you would take. The other ones I want to deal with, though. These are important. So what they did not say. Let's take a look at what they did not say. Now, the interesting thing is that as I listened to all these testimonials, there was no one thing that was the common denominator. And when you see that, you'll know there's got to be a common denominator here somewhere, but it's got to be deeper. It's got to be deeper, and these 6 things are merely symptoms, because I know a lot of Christians, a ton of Christians, in fact, if not most Christians, do have questions about these very same things as well, yet their faith survives. So what makes the difference between Christians, this pool of people, this pool over here abandons their faith on those same 6 issues. This pool of people does not abandon their faith. What is the difference between the 2 pools? This is what I think is the difference. There are 2 things they did not talk about, and I found that even more revealing. Major observation number 1. When these deconverters described their previous Christian life, there was a lot of mention about all the activities they did and what they believed. So it was beliefs plus activities, such as teach Sunday school, teach the Bible, lead people to faith in Christ, but talk of experiencing the presence of God in their life was almost completely absent. I can only think of one deconverter I listened to, and the only reason he talked to it because he had challenged to talk about it, so he talked about an particular experience he had. But none of them seemed to experience the presence of God on a regular, ongoing, daily basis. When I talk about the presence of God, I'm talking about being aware of the presence of another presence with you during the day. It might only be occasionally at first, once a week, maybe twice a day, but at least it's there. Almost a tangible presence of God. The awareness there is a being with me, and this being is the Father of lights, the one who's the origin of every good thing given and every perfect gift. That was almost completely absent. And so it seemed to me that the Christianity that they abandoned was mostly activities and living a certain lifestyle, but it wasn't a relationship with God in any meaningful sort of way. Major observation number 2. This is huge. It applies to everybody across the board, no matter how sincere you are in walking with the Lord. They seem to be completely unaware of how much they had been shaped by our culture. They were culture-led rather than Christ-led. And to expand on that a little bit, we live every day immersed in our culture. Maybe you're taking a bit of a break right now, but even when you head out to town, or if you get down to the beach or whatever, you sort of get a taste of what secular culture is like. We live every day, and it constantly forms and shapes us. We want to fit in. We don't want to be looking like an idiot. We don't want to be looking like jerks. We don't want to be talk like morons. We want to fit in, and so there's something subtle about us. It's a subconscious thing. There's a feedback, and we are not even aware of this. But when we say things that's a little off or something, you pick that up, and you may not even be aware of it, but you change how you talk next time. You don't wear like clothes from the 1890s when you go to town, although I do kind of like that. I was looking at a picture it was painted around 1902, and there's this young woman sitting by the seaside wearing this really nice outfit, but it was a plain everyday outfit, but it was really, I don't know, classy and feminine. I said to Patty, "Oh, I wish women dressed like that nowadays." And Patty says, "Well, if women dress like that, men would have to dress like they did back then as well." That's a good point. Now, how would I feel? And I thought I would be willing to dress like they did back then, the tweed coats and hats or whatever. Now, that's just pure subjective nostalgia. It's nothing to do with how we're dressed here today. Obviously, I'm not wearing, 1902 clothing here. But it shapes us in every way. We begin to approve the things that culture approves. If culture disapproves of something, we subconsciously begin to disapprove of that as well. This is constantly shaping us. I assume I am being programmed every day, no matter how sincere I am in my relationship with God. And that is why I sincerely, on a daily basis, God, renew my mind. Renew my mind. I cannot renew my own mind. I can't tell how I'm programmed and shaped. But this is major observation number 2, is that they were utterly unaware that they had been totally shaped by the culture that we live in today. And their whole experience of Christianity was actually being seen through the eyes of our culture. They were the products of our culture. Okay, what kind of person abandoned their faith? Three major possibilities right here. And number 1, I was really interested in upcoming Christian leaders or people already in young Christian leaderships. Kate, did you? Oh, that's fine. So I wanted to know what kind of people. Some were youth pastors who helped many grow in their faith. After a formal debate I did at the University of Calgary, the atheists invited me over to the pub to have a good talk, and I've had my best talks with atheists, especially if there's a group of them, and I'm the only theist, and then there's a pile of atheists. They're totally free. They don't feel they're cornered, outnumbered, and everything, and we could just be relaxed and have a good conversation. I had a great conversation with the guy right beside me. Finally, it was time to go. He says, "Well, I got to go to pick up my somebody or another," and I got to go too, and whatever. And he said, I was once a youth pastor," he said. And wow, I wish I'd have known that like an hour ago. He didn't tell me that. He had a lot of questions about the problem of evil that we talked about. Former youth pastor, and there's more that you'll see online. Full-time missionaries. I listened to full-time missionaries, like they were even in other countries, leading people to Christ and helping start new churches, and then they just packed it in. Youth leaders, trained apologists, Sunday school teachers, lots of Sunday school teachers, worship leaders and musicians. Remember one of them, was it Steingard or the other guy? There was 2. He says, I used to feel this great sense of awe and holiness and whatever. And then he says, I went to a U2 concert. And he says, I felt the same thing there. And what people will often mistake physiochemical responsiveness for the presence of God. Now, conversely, the presence of God, we are designed to respond to the presence of God. So we will experience a feeling of awe and worship if the presence of God is here. But a physiochemical, artificial response shouldn't be confused. And he was talking about that, and he eventually tossed his faith. Option number 1, they never were born again despite fruitful evangelism, despite the fact that they led people to Christ and discipled people. They never were born again. And that would account possibly, I'm not going to take a position here. We could spend a whole week on that subject, but accounts for almost nothing was ever said about experiencing the presence of God in their lives. And if that's true, it's very sobering indeed, because there is a healthy percentage of young people in our churches today who believe they're Christians, and in fact they are not. Perhaps even some here, although I would hope not. I think even coming here is a bit of a filter. You got to be, semi-sincere about your relationship with God, even come to Anchor House. So hopefully none of you, but I would never assure you of that case. And for example, 1 John, even now many antichrists have appeared. From this we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they were not really of us. And so he's talking about a specific situation. Doesn't mean that everybody necessarily who stops going to church is a servant of the Antichrist, but it does mean that there will be people who are leaving because they never really did have a relationship with God. Now, their description of antichrists, he says, even though many antichrists have appeared, we're talking about people who are hostile and antagonistic to Christ. There is a minority, but a fairly significant minority of deconverters who are now hostile. Like this youth pastor was so hostile, he had joined an atheist club in the city of Calgary to promote atheism and to fight against theism. Option number 2, their faith was shipwrecked, but they still may be born again. That's option number 2. For example, in 1 Timothy, fight the good fight, keeping faith, a good conscience, which some have rejected and suffered shipwreck in regard to their faith. Among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan so that they'll be taught not to blaspheme. Now, it depends what you understand by so they'll be taught not to blaspheme. Is it because they are still believers and they need to be tossed into the lion's den for a little bit so that they will come back to Christ? Is that what it means? There are a couple of cases like that. 1 Corinthians, for example, the guy sleeping with his stepmother, deliver him over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, but yet for the salvation of his soul. So there's this option number 2. They're wrecked as far as spiritually goes, but they'll be saved, yet so is by fire. Let's put it that way. Okay, option number 3, they have committed apostasy by breaking the everlasting covenant. And it is prophesied that in the last days there will be many people who break the everlasting covenant. Hebrews spends a lot of time warning us on that. Hebrews chapter 10 is kind of the climax. It talks about a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. And he's talking about that for those who have trampled underfoot the Son of God, have regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and has insulted the Spirit of grace. And I put the circle around that's past tense. So he's talking about people who had been sanctified by the blood of Jesus Christ, but now nothing remains but the terrifying fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries because they had done these 3 things. Now, there's your 3 options, and yes. Sorry, I forgot your name.
Nick.
Nick. Yeah, Nick. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
So, I want to go down like a rabbit hole, but it seems like is this like regarding like people who were Christians and now are no longer, or like?
That's option 3. Yeah, option 3 is they break the everlasting covenant. But I'm just throwing the 3 options out there because I'm not, this is not where we're going this week, although we can discuss it, outside of the seminar, but those are the 3 options. A lot of times I think it's better to throw the options out there and say, you search the scriptures and see what you think is going on. Yes?
What does apostasy mean?
It means, the apostasia has two nuances in Greek. One is a rebellion against God. So in that context, you can have non-believers involved in a rebellion against God, and apostasia, and that's prophesied before the return of Christ. It says there are 2 things that need to happen. One is the apostasy must occur. and which I think is pretty much full-blown in our culture today, this rebellion against God, the secular rebellion, but it also has the other aspect, which is a falling away from God, turning away from Christ. And I would say if you wanted that defined, if you wanted to define it, I would define it right there, just to be safe. Just take what the scriptures say of defining this danger here. But I want to be cautious here because that we ended on option 3, but there's option 1 and 2 as well. I mean, and I've had enormous amounts of discussions with my friends. Everybody's from Reformed to Arminian to Calvinism and everything else. So I know from experience this is a long conversation. And I don't try and convince anybody of any particular thing. I have my leanings. I mean, I could talk about my own pilgrimage in this area, but that would be option number 3. Takeaway. And then we got to quit for 15 minutes and then we come back. Takeaway and application. If they were never saved, then that implies that there may be an awful lot of people, including those in positions of Christian leadership, who believe they are saved but are mistaken. Option number 2, there is a great danger of either shipwreck of one's faith or of apostasy. Now, either way, any of these 3 options all converge to one problem, and the one problem is what we're going to deal for the rest of this week, this problem of deconversion. This is really to do with the consequences of deconversion, the eternal consequences, whether they're saved or not. Our mission in this world, and there's people, I work with deconverters. I have never seen one come back to Christ, but I never assume that I will not see one come back to Christ. And I'm involved very much in the lives of 2 people right now who are, one's an ex-evangelical, but he's as close to the deconverter as possible, pretty much repudiating everything to do with Christianity, but still claiming to be a Christ follower. We should never assume that we know what the eternal destiny of another person is, no matter how badly they have reviled Christ and abandoned things and just willfully turned away. We could always pray and hope and do our part in serving that person to see. And so how do we serve them? What I'm going to cover next, starting at 10 o'clock. So let's take a quick break and come back at 10, and we'll start the positive stuff. And I'll just leave this up there for you to read for your own enjoyment. You're welcome. Yes?
Are you going to be teaching all the morning sessions?
No. Well, right now I'm just teaching the first 2, but apparently I was slated to teach the third afternoon session on Friday and then the one session on Saturday, but with a prayer retreat, that may be shoved into some morning sessions, but that'll be the last half of the week.
So I'll leave you at the mic because you're teaching the next session, right?
I'm teaching the next session, yeah. And then I'll take the mic off because somebody's doing the third one this morning.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why do